I remember the exact time because I checked my phone twice, not out of urgency but because the night felt loose and unstructured, like it could slip away if I didn't pin it down somehow. It was 12:47 a.m., the kind of hour when even familiar streets feel borrowed, and I was walking home from the late bus stop with a light drizzle hanging in the air that never quite turned into rain, which already made everything feel slightly wrong. The streetlights were on, but they didn't seem confident about it, flickering just enough to make me notice, and the pavement reflected their yellow glow in dull, uneven patches as if the ground itself was tired of holding light. I could hear my own footsteps clearly, louder than usual, echoing off the closed storefronts and parked cars, and that sound kept reminding me how alone I was out there. I'd taken this route hundreds of times before, always the same sidewalk, the same narrow strip of concrete running past the old bakery and the silent laundromat, but that night it felt longer, stretched out, like each step carried more weight than it should have. The air smelled damp and metallic, and somewhere far away a siren wailed and then disappeared, leaving the silence heavier than before. I was thinking about nothing important, just letting my mind drift the way it does when you're tired and close to home, replaying small moments from the day and half forgetting them before they finished. My shoulders were hunched against the cold, my hands buried in my jacket pockets, and I was already picturing the warmth of my apartment when I stepped off the curb. The moment my foot touched the sidewalk, I felt it, and I stopped without meaning to, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. The concrete beneath my shoe wasn't cold the way it should have been on a damp winter night, but warm, noticeably warm, like I'd stepped onto something that had been sitting in the sun all day, which made no sense at all. I remember the exact time because I checked my phone twice, not out of urgency but because the night felt loose and unstructured, like it could slip away if I didn't pin it down somehow. It was 12:47 a.m., the kind of hour when even familiar streets feel borrowed, and I was walking home from the late bus stop with a light drizzle hanging in the air that never quite turned into rain, which already made everything feel slightly wrong. The streetlights were on, but they didn't seem confident about it, flickering just enough to make me notice, and the pavement reflected their yellow glow in dull, uneven patches as if the ground itself was tired of holding light. I could hear my own footsteps clearly, louder than usual, echoing off the closed storefronts and parked cars, and that sound kept reminding me how alone I was out there. I'd taken this route hundreds of times before, always the same sidewalk, the same narrow strip of concrete running past the old bakery and the silent laundromat, but that night it felt longer, stretched out, like each step carried more weight than it should have. The air smelled damp and metallic, and somewhere far away a siren wailed and then disappeared, leaving the silence heavier than before. I was thinking about nothing important, just letting my mind drift the way it does when you're tired and close to home, replaying small moments from the day and half forgetting them before they finished. My shoulders were hunched against the cold, my hands buried in my jacket pockets, and I was already picturing the warmth of my apartment when I stepped off the curb. The moment my foot touched the sidewalk, I felt it, and I stopped without meaning to, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. The concrete beneath my shoe wasn't cold the way it should have been on a damp winter night, but warm, noticeably warm, like I'd stepped onto something that had been sitting in the sun all day, which made no sense at all. The street stayed quiet, but in that silence I became aware of a faint, almost imperceptible rhythm beneath my foot, not a sound exactly, more like a suggestion of movement that made my skin prickle. I pulled my foot back again and laughed under my breath, a short, nervous sound that didn't make me feel any better. The laugh echoed oddly between the buildings and died too quickly, leaving the night feeling even emptier, and I realized my hands were clenched tight in my pockets. Standing there, I considered crossing the street and taking the long way around, avoiding that stretch of sidewalk entirely, but the thought of adding extra minutes alone in the dark made me hesitate. Home was right there, just a few blocks away, and the idea of turning back over something I couldn't even explain felt like giving in to a fear I didn't understand. I told myself I was tired, that my senses were playing tricks on me, and I forced myself to step fully onto the sidewalk, committing to it. Both feet settled onto the concrete, and the warmth was unmistakable now, spreading under me in a way that felt disturbingly intimate, like standing barefoot on skin. The strangest part was that it didn't feel uniformly warm, but warmer in some spots than others, as if whatever was beneath the surface wasn't still. I shifted my weight slightly, and the warmth shifted too, responding in a way that made my throat go dry. I stood there longer than I should have, staring down, my mind racing through explanations and rejecting each one as quickly as it formed. There were no steam vents here, no underground systems that I knew of, and even if there were, that wouldn't explain the softness, the sense of something yielding just a little under pressure. I became acutely aware of my breathing then, shallow and quick, fogging faintly in the air, and of how alone the street was. No cars passed, no windows lit up, and the streetlights seemed farther apart than they had a moment before, leaving me standing in a dim pool of light with nowhere else to look. When I finally forced myself to take another step forward, the warmth followed, always directly beneath my feet, never extending ahead of me or trailing behind. Each step felt like a question I didn't want answered, and with every footfall my unease grew heavier. I tried stepping off to the side, closer to the building wall, and for a brief second the concrete felt normal again, cold and hard, which sent a rush of relief through me. But as soon as I adjusted my path back toward the center of the sidewalk, the warmth returned, patient and persistent. It occurred to me then that the warm area seemed to be following me, not the other way around, staying directly under where I chose to walk. The thought slid into my mind quietly and settled there, refusing to leave, making my steps slow and deliberate as if I could somehow outpace it. I stopped again, standing still, and waited to see if the warmth would fade now that I wasn't moving. It didn't, and if anything it felt stronger when I stayed in one place, a steady, low heat that seemed to press up against my soles, accompanied by that faint, unsettling rhythm. I told myself not to think of it as breathing, but the comparison came anyway, uninvited and vivid, and once it was there I couldn't shake it. The warmth seemed to rise and fall in slow cycles, subtle enough that I might have dismissed them under other circumstances, but unmistakable now that I was paying attention. A wave of fear washed over me then, sharp and sudden, and I took a few quick steps forward, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was happening. The warmth kept pace effortlessly, never lagging, never surging ahead, like it knew exactly where I was going. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, some prankster or explanation made flesh, but the street was empty. The dark windows stared back at me blankly, and the drizzle had started to pick up, softening the edges of the world and making everything feel further away. My mind started to fixate on the idea that if I kept walking, this would keep happening, step after step, all the way home. The thought of carrying this sensation with me, of it accompanying me like a silent companion, made my chest tighten with a kind of quiet panic. I considered running, just to see what would happen, but the idea of losing control, of not feeling each step clearly, scared me even more. So I walked, slow and careful, every sense tuned to the ground beneath me, every footfall an experiment I didn't want to conduct. The warmth never spread beyond the sidewalk, and when I stepped briefly onto the grass strip near the curb, the cold soaked through my shoe immediately, biting and familiar. That contrast was almost worse, because it confirmed that the warmth was real, localized, and intentional in a way I didn't want to admit. I kept my eyes fixed ahead then, focusing on the outline of my building in the distance, its dark shape barely visible against the cloudy sky. Each step brought me closer, but the distance seemed stubborn, stretching out as if the night didn't want me to reach it just yet. At some point, I realized I could feel the warmth even when my foot was in the air, just before it touched down, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. That anticipation made my stomach churn, and I found myself hesitating before each step, dreading the moment of contact. I wondered what would happen if I stopped walking entirely and just stood there until morning, until someone else came along and shared the sidewalk with me. The thought of explaining this to another person felt impossible, and the idea of standing there alone until dawn felt just as unbearable. As I passed the bakery, I noticed the familiar smell of old bread and yeast was gone, replaced by something faintly sweet and organic that I couldn't quite place. It reminded me of warmth and dampness and something alive, and I quickened my pace without realizing it. The warmth responded immediately, staying perfectly aligned with my steps, and I felt a strange sense of being observed, not from above or behind, but from below. That idea made my skin crawl, and I forced myself not to look down again, afraid of what my imagination might show me. When I reached the corner near my building, where the sidewalk dipped slightly before rising again, the warmth intensified for a moment, pooling under my feet as if pleased I'd come this far. I paused there, my hand hovering over my phone, debating whether to call someone just to hear a voice. I didn't call, because I didn't know what I would say, and because part of me was afraid that as soon as I distracted myself, something worse would happen. So I stayed quiet, listening to the rain now falling more steadily, each drop a small, sharp sound against the concrete. The final stretch to my building felt unreal, like walking through a memory rather than a place, and when I finally stepped onto the concrete pad in front of the entrance, the warmth came with me. It didn't stop at the edge of the sidewalk the way I desperately hoped it would. I stood there under the dim entry light, my key trembling slightly in my hand, feeling the warmth gather beneath both feet, steady and calm. The door was right in front of me, solid and familiar, but I hesitated, suddenly unsure if I wanted to bring whatever this was inside with me. I lifted one foot slowly and placed it on the metal threshold, feeling the cold immediately, and a small sob of relief escaped me before I could stop it. For a moment, the warmth seemed to linger under my other foot, reluctant to let go. Then I stepped fully inside, pulling the door shut behind me with a soft click that echoed too loudly in the empty hallway. The warmth was gone, replaced by the chill of the concrete floor, and I stood there shaking, listening for something I couldn't name. I waited for a long time before moving again, my heart slowly settling, my mind replaying every step of the walk home. Even now, sitting in my apartment with my shoes still on, I swear I can feel a faint heat lingering in my soles, like the sidewalk remembers me, and that thought keeps me awake that I first noticed her at 1:12 a.m. Because the pedestrian signal across the street was stuck on red and I had nothing else to focus on but the empty intersection and the soft ticking sound the crosswalk button made when it thought someone might still be waiting. The night was clear but heavy, the kind of late summer heat that clings to your skin even after midnight, and I remember thinking how quiet the city felt for a Friday. She was standing at the corner under the streetlight, not moving, not checking her phone, not shifting her weight the way people usually do when they're waiting to cross. At first I assumed she was just another late-night commuter, but something about how still she was made me look twice, and that second look didn't feel comfortable. She wore a dark coat despite the warmth, and her hair fell straight down over her shoulders, blending into the shadows behind her so that her face seemed oddly unfinished. I couldn't tell how old she was, or even what she looked like clearly, only that she was facing the street as if waiting for something that wasn't coming. The light changed, and I stepped off the curb with the other two people who had been waiting beside me, expecting her to move too. She didn't. I glanced sideways as I crossed, half expecting her to step out at the last moment, but she remained exactly where she was, standing just beyond the edge of the light. On the other side, I slowed down and looked back, pretending to check my phone while watching her from the corner of my eye. She hadn't changed position at all, and no one else seemed to notice her presence, which struck me as strange only because she was so clearly there. I told myself it wasn't my business, that people stand on corners all the time for reasons you don't understand, but the thought didn't settle properly. There was something about the way she occupied that space, like she wasn't waiting to cross so much as marking a spot. I continued down the block, my footsteps echoing softly, but after a few seconds I felt the urge to look back again, a quiet pull that tightened just below my ribs. She was still there, still alone, the streetlight humming faintly above her, and the intersection otherwise empty. I stopped walking then, standing in the shadow of a closed cafe, watching from a distance I told myself was safe. A car passed through the intersection, slowing slightly as it turned, and its headlights swept across the corner where she stood without any sign of recognition. That was the first moment I felt something truly wrong, a small cold thread of unease winding through my thoughts. The driver hadn't reacted at all, hadn't hesitated or leaned forward, hadn't done anything that suggested he'd seen a person standing inches from the curb. Another car followed, then a cyclist, and none of them acknowledged her existence, not with a glance or a shift in posture. She remained untouched by their awareness, still and silent, and I started to wonder if the problem was me. I rubbed my eyes, blinking hard, and looked again, half expecting her to be gone. She wasn't. If anything, she seemed more solid now, more defined against the light, as if my attention was what gave her weight. I became aware then of how quiet the night had grown, how even the distant hum of traffic seemed muted. And how alone I felt despite being surrounded by familiar buildings. My phone buzzed with a notification, startling me, and for a moment I considered leaving, pretending I'd never seen her. Instead, I found myself walking back toward the corner, my steps slow and cautious, each one accompanied by a growing sense of dread I couldn't fully explain. I stayed on the opposite sidewalk, keeping the street between us, and stopped a few yards away. Up close, she looked more ordinary than I expected, which somehow made it worse. Her coat was worn at the cuffs, her shoes scuffed and practical, and her posture suggested patience rather than menace, yet something about her presence made the air feel dense. I cleared my throat quietly, not even intending to speak, just to test the space between us. She didn't react. The sound seemed to vanish before it reached her, swallowed by the night. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice lower than usual, uncertain and thin. The words hung there awkwardly, unanswered, and I felt foolish for having said anything at all. She didn't turn her head or shift her stance, didn't acknowledge me in any way, and that refusal felt deliberate. It was as if she was listening for something else, something only she could hear. A couple walked past me then, laughing softly, their hands brushing as they went by, and relief washed over me at the sight of other people. They passed right between me and the corner, and for a moment her body was hidden from view. When they cleared the space, she was still there, unchanged, and neither of them had reacted, not even subconsciously. They hadn't slowed or glanced over, hadn't made room the way people do when navigating around a stranger. I felt a sudden, irrational fear that if I stopped looking at her, she might disappear, or worse, move. The thought made my chest tighten, and I realized I was holding my breath. The streetlight above her flickered once, briefly dimming, and my heart jumped as I watched her silhouette waver. When the light steadied, she remained, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I checked the time again, needing some anchor in reality, and saw that only 6 minutes had passed since I first noticed her. It felt longer, stretched thin by my attention, as if time behaved differently around that corner. I noticed then that the signal button she stood beside wasn't lit, unlike the one I'd pressed earlier across the street. It was as if the intersection didn't register her presence at all, and that thought settled uncomfortably in my mind. I took a step closer, then stopped, a sudden wave of reluctance washing over me, warning me not to cross an invisible boundary. The air seemed cooler near her, heavier, and my skin prickled as if anticipating contact. Her face remained turned away, but I became acutely aware of the back of her head, the line of her neck, the way her hair lay unnaturally still despite the faint breeze moving through the street. Everything about her felt paused. I wondered how long she had been standing there before I arrived, and whether anyone else had noticed her at all. The idea that I might be the only one unsettled me more than the thought of her being alone. Another car passed, close enough that its side mirror nearly brushed her coat, and still there was no reaction, no flinch, no acknowledgement from either side. It was as if she existed in a layer just beneath the surface of the world. My thoughts began to spiral then, circling questions I didn't want to answer, and I felt the urge to leave again, stronger this time. Staying felt like an invitation I didn't understand. As I turned to go, I felt it, subtle but unmistakable, a shift in the air behind me, like attention finally being redirected. I didn't look back right away, afraid of what I might see if I did. When I finally forced myself to glance over my shoulder, she was still facing the street, still motionless, but something had changed. I couldn't say what exactly, only that the corner felt aware now, like a held breath waiting to be released. I walked away quickly, not running but not lingering, my footsteps sounding too loud in my ears. Every instinct told me not to look back again, but the urge was there, nagging and persistent. At the end of the block, I gave in and turned my head, my heart pounding as I searched the intersection. She was still there, exactly where I'd left her, and yet the relief I expected didn't come. Instead, a quiet dread settled over me, because I realized something else then, something that made my mouth go dry. She wasn't alone anymore. A man stood near her now, close enough that their shadows nearly touched, and he looked just as still, just as unnoticed by the passing world. He faced a different direction, watching the opposite street, and no one reacted to him either. As I watched, another figure appeared on the far corner, then another further down the block, each one stationary, each one ignored. They didn't look at each other, didn't interact, just stood, marking their places in the city. I turned away and didn't stop walking until I reached my apartment, my hands shaking as I unlocked the door. Inside, the familiar walls did little to calm me, and sleep felt impossible. Even now, lying awake in the dark, I keep thinking about that corner, about how ordinary it looked, and how easy it would be to stand there without being noticed. Sometimes I wonder how long you can stay before the world forgets you were ever meant to move. The first thing I noticed was how quiet my apartment felt when I stepped outside, even though I hadn't closed the door yet. It was 11:38 p.m., late enough that the building hallway lights were dimmed automatically, casting long shadows that followed me down the stairs. Outside, the main road was still busy, headlights sliding past one another in a steady flow, and that familiar nighttime traffic noise usually greeted me before I even reached the sidewalk. That night, it didn't. I stood at the bottom of the steps for a moment, waiting for the sound to catch up, the low roar of engines and tires on asphalt that normally filled the air like a constant breath. I could see the cars clearly, their motion undeniable, but the sound was thinner than it should have been, distant, like it was coming from behind a closed door. I told myself it was just a lull, maybe a trick of the wind, and started walking toward the corner. With each step, the visual rhythm of traffic stayed the same, but the noise continued to fade, not cutting out abruptly, just draining away slowly, like someone turning a dial I couldn't see. By the time I reached the crosswalk, I realized I could hear my own breathing more clearly than the engines. That alone made my chest tighten, because traffic noise in this area never fully disappears, not even at dawn. Cars passed inches from the curb, headlights washing over my shoes, reflections rippling across the wet pavement from an earlier rain. I watched a delivery truck rumble by, saw the vibration in its frame, the slight bounce as it hit a pothole, yet the sound it should have made was muted, flattened, like it had been wrapped in something thick. I pressed the crosswalk button out of habit. The click was sharp and loud in the quiet, startling enough that I pulled my hand back. The signal began its countdown, the white walking figure lighting up, but the usual chirping sound never came. When I stepped off the curb, my footfall echoed faintly, far louder than it should have been against the movement around me. The imbalance made my skin prickle, as if I was standing too close to something dangerous without realizing it. Halfway across, the traffic sound faded even more, until what remained was barely a suggestion, a memory of noise rather than noise itself. The cars still moved, their tires spinning, their brake lights flaring red, but it was like watching a video on mute. I stopped walking. Nothing changed. A sedan passed directly in front of me, close enough that I could have reached out and touched the hood. I saw the driver's hands on the steering wheel, his mouth moving as if he was talking to someone, maybe singing along to the radio. I heard nothing from him, nothing from the car, not even the rush of air as it cut through the night. My heart started beating harder, each thud loud in my ears, and the silence around it made it feel exposed, like something could hear it. I finished crossing quickly and reached the opposite sidewalk, turning to face the road again, needing to confirm I wasn't imagining it. The traffic was still there, steady and normal in every visual sense, but the sound had thinned to almost nothing, as if the world had decided I didn't need to hear it anymore. Other sounds were still present. Somewhere behind me, a door slammed. A few blocks away, someone laughed. My shoes scuffed against concrete with an uncomfortable clarity. Only the traffic, the loudest, most constant sound in this part of the city, had withdrawn. I began walking along the road, keeping the cars in my peripheral vision, half expecting the sound to rush back all at once. Instead, with every step I took away from the intersection, the quiet deepened, pressing in around me like a held breath. I passed a bus stop where a woman sat scrolling on her phone. I could hear the faint tap of her thumb against the screen as I went by, but when a bus pulled past us, its massive frame sliding between us and the road, it made no sound at all. That was when the fear stopped being abstract. I slowed down, my movements careful, deliberate, as if sudden motion might draw attention. The streetlights hummed faintly overhead, that sound unchanged, and it struck me how selective the silence was. At the next corner, a group of cars stopped at a red light. I stood close enough to see exhaust curling from their tailpipes, white clouds drifting and dispersing in the cool air. The visual proof of sound without sound made my stomach turn. I tried clearing my throat loudly. The noise rang out, brittle and alone. I felt suddenly aware of my own presence in a way I never had before, like I was the only solid thing left in a thinning world. As the light turned green, the cars surged forward together, an action that should have been overwhelming, but the silence barely shifted. It was as if the sound couldn't keep up with the motion, lagging far behind. I started to wonder if the silence was centered on me. To test it, I stopped again, letting a car pass while I stood perfectly still. Nothing changed. Then I took a few steps backward, retracing my path, my pulse quickening with each movement. The traffic sound didn't return. Instead, something else became clearer. Between my footsteps and my breathing, I began to hear a faint internal noise, a low, steady pressure in my ears, the kind you feel when descending too quickly in an elevator. It wasn't silence anymore, it was something heavier, something that filled the space where sound should have been. I realized then that I couldn't hear the city beyond a certain distance. Buildings looked normal, windows lit, signs glowing, but it felt like I was sealed inside a smaller version of the street, a bubble where certain rules no longer applied. A cyclist rode past me, close enough that I felt the brush of displaced air against my arm. He didn't ring his bell. I didn't hear his chain or tires. He didn't react to my presence at all. For a brief, terrifying moment, I wondered if I had died without realizing it, if this was some muted afterimage of the world. The thought lodged itself in my mind and refused to leave. I reached the block where I needed to turn toward home and hesitated, looking both ways. The cars moved on, endless and quiet, and the silence felt patient, like it was waiting for me to make a decision. As I turned down the side street, the traffic was still visible at the far end, headlights flickering between buildings, but the sound was completely gone now. In its place was a dense stillness that made every small noise feel intrusive. I could hear my clothes shift as I walked. I could hear the faint buzz of electricity from a nearby transformer. I could hear my heartbeat again, loud and insistent. Halfway down the block, I stopped and looked back at the main road. The cars were still there, still moving, still behaving exactly as they should, but they felt distant, unreal, like a scene playing somewhere I no longer fully belonged to. That was when I realized something else. No one else seemed to notice. Pedestrians walked along the sidewalk near the road, talking to each other, laughing, stepping off curbs without hesitation. Their mouths moved, their expressions animated, but whatever they were hearing, I wasn't part of it. I raised my voice then, calling out to one of them without thinking. The sound came out too loud, too raw, and a few people glanced at me with mild confusion before continuing on their way. The silence didn't break. I hurried the rest of the way home, my nerves stretched tight, every step feeling watched by the quiet itself. When I finally reached my building and pulled the door open, the traffic sound rushed back all at once, loud and overwhelming, like a wave crashing over me. I stood in the lobby, shaking, letting the noise wash over me until my breathing slowed. Later that night, lying in bed, the window cracked open to let in the city sounds I'd always taken for granted, I tried to convince myself it had been stress, fatigue, anything explainable. But every now and then, between passing cars, there's a pause where the sound thins out, just for a second. And in that second, I'm afraid the city is deciding whether to let me hear it again. It was just after midnight when I left the train station, the digital clock above the platform stairs blinking 12:09 in a tired blue light that made everything look slightly unreal. The last train had emptied quickly, people peeling off into different directions, and by the time I stepped out onto the street, the night had settled into that quiet stretch where the city feels like it's holding something back. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the faint smell of damp concrete from rain earlier in the evening, and the clouds hung low enough to blur the moon into a pale smudge. I pulled my jacket tighter and started the familiar walk home, telling myself how close I was, how little attention the route required, even though the street already felt longer than usual. My footsteps sounded sharp and clear against the sidewalk, each one landing with a small echo that bounced between parked cars and darkened shop windows. That sound was oddly comforting at first, proof that I was there, moving, occupying space in a quiet world that didn't seem to care much either way. I'd gone maybe half a block when I noticed the rhythm. At first, it didn't register as anything external, just a slight irregularity in the echo, a softness where there should have been a clean return of sound. I adjusted my pace unconsciously, slowing a little, listening more closely, and that was when I heard it clearly. Another set of footsteps. They matched mine almost perfectly, the same heel-to-toe pattern, the same weight, but they landed just a fraction of a second later, like a delayed response. Not close enough to feel breath on my neck, not far enough to dismiss as someone else on the street. I stopped. The other footsteps stopped too, not immediately, but after that same brief delay, as if whatever was behind me needed a moment to decide whether to freeze. The silence that followed felt stretched thin, fragile, like it might tear if I moved wrong. I told myself it was an echo, some strange acoustic trick caused by the narrow street and the damp air, even though I'd walked this way countless times without ever hearing anything like it. Still, the explanation felt better than the alternative, and I forced myself to start walking again. My steps resumed, steady and deliberate, and there they were again, following behind me, slower by just enough to notice. The gap between my foot hitting the ground and the answering sound never changed, never closed, never widened, and that consistency made my skin prickle. I didn't look back right away. There's a moment in situations like that where you believe that as long as you don't confirm it, things can still be normal, and I clung to that idea longer than I should have. Instead, I focused on the street ahead, the yellow pools of light cast by street lamps, the dark gaps between them where anything could be hiding. As I passed under the next light, I sped up slightly, testing it, and the footsteps behind me sped up too, still slower, still precise, like a careful imitation. My breathing became louder in my ears, and I became painfully aware of the sound of my clothes shifting with each step. I told myself it had to be another person, someone walking home just like me, maybe matching my pace without realizing it. That happened sometimes, didn't it, people falling into the same rhythm without meaning to. So I slowed down abruptly, almost to a stop, pretending to check my phone. The footsteps slowed as well, dragging just enough to maintain that same distance. And then stopped, a beat after I did. The pause felt intentional, measured, and my fingers tightened around my phone until my knuckles ached. I glanced at the screen without really seeing it, the glow reflecting faintly off the dark window beside me, and in that reflection I tried to catch movement behind me. All I saw was the empty stretch of sidewalk and my own tense outline staring back. When I started walking again, the footsteps returned, patient and unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. The sound wasn't heavy or aggressive, just present, which somehow made it worse. The street narrowed as I moved farther from the station, the buildings older here, leaning slightly inward like they were listening. The farther I went, the fewer signs of life I saw, no lit windows, no passing cars, just the soft hum of distant traffic bleeding in from somewhere else. I began to feel foolish for being afraid, angry at myself for letting something so vague get under my skin. Fear likes specifics, and this was all suggestion and implication, nothing solid enough to confront. Still, my shoulders stayed tight, and my steps grew careful, as if I were walking on something fragile. I tried another test then, stepping deliberately out of rhythm, dragging one foot slightly, then taking 2 quick steps in a row. The answering footsteps followed the pattern, imperfect but unmistakably responsive, always lagging behind, never overlapping with mine. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I crossed the street at the next intersection without waiting for the light, my shoes splashing through a shallow puddle, and I listened hard as I reached the other side. For a brief moment, there was only my breathing and the distant city. Then, one by one, the slower footsteps resumed, now on the opposite sidewalk, the delay unchanged. I stopped near a lamppost and leaned against it, trying to ground myself in something solid and real. The metal was cold through my jacket, and I focused on that sensation, on the smell of wet leaves gathered at the curb, on anything that anchored me to the present. The footsteps stopped too, lingering just out of sight, close enough that I imagined I could feel their presence like a pressure against my back. I fought the urge to turn around, my mind filling the space behind me with shapes I didn't want to see. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath, the words sounding thin and lonely in the night. No voice answered, but the silence that followed felt attentive, as if something had heard me and was considering a response. I started walking again, faster this time, my heart thudding in my chest, and the footsteps followed, never rushing, never falling behind. The slower pace made them feel deliberate, controlled, as though whatever was making them didn't need to hurry. I noticed then that despite how quiet the street was, no other footsteps joined ours. No one passed me, no one approached from ahead, and the isolation began to feel curated, like the night had been cleared just for this. My apartment was only a few blocks away, but each one felt longer than the last, the distance stretching in a way that made me doubt my own sense of direction. I checked street signs twice, then again, needing reassurance that I was still where I thought I was. The footsteps never faltered. At one point, I heard my own pace begin to sync with the slower rhythm behind me, my body unconsciously adjusting, and the realization jolted me. I forced myself to break the pattern, nearly stumbling as I changed speed abruptly. The other footsteps adjusted too, reclaiming that small delay like it was essential. I wondered then what would happen if I stopped completely and refused to move, if the night would just freeze with me in it, locked in that awkward standoff forever. The idea of standing there until morning, until someone else appeared, felt both comforting and impossible. As I passed a closed storefront, the dark glass reflected the street back at me, warped and dim, and I glanced at it without thinking. For a split second, I thought I saw movement that didn't match my own, a shift that came just after I did. I looked away quickly, my pulse racing, my mind filling in details I couldn't trust. The footsteps sounded closer now, not because the distance had changed, but because my attention was fully fixed on them. Each delayed step felt like a question tapping at the back of my skull, asking how long I planned to keep walking. When my building finally came into view, a wave of relief washed over me so strong it almost made my knees weak. The entrance light glowed warmly, familiar and safe, and I focused on it like a lifeline. I quickened my pace, nearly jogging the last few yards, my shoes slapping loudly against the pavement. The footsteps behind me continued, unbroken, still slower, still following. As I reached the steps, I took them 2 at a time, fumbling for my keys, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The sound behind me reached the base of the steps just after I did, stopping when I stopped, waiting. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, the hinge creaking softly, and stepped inside without looking back. The door closed behind me with a heavy click that echoed in the small lobby. I stood there for several seconds, heart pounding, listening. There were no footsteps inside, no echo following me, just the low hum of the building and my own uneven breathing. Slowly, carefully, I turned and looked through the glass door. The sidewalk outside was empty. I stayed there longer than necessary, watching the street, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the light, but nothing moved. Eventually, I forced myself to go upstairs, locking my apartment door behind me with more care than usual. That night, Lying in bed, the quiet felt too deep, every small sound magnified. When I shifted my feet against the sheets, I listened automatically for a delayed response, a softer movement following my own. Sometimes, just before sleep takes me, I swear I can still hear it, a slower step matching mine somewhere just out of reach, waiting for me to start walking again. It happened on a night when the city felt thinner than usual, like the noise and movement had been stretched out and left gaps behind. I remember checking the time as I left the office because the building lights had already shifted into their late-night dim setting, and it read 10:56 p.m. Later than I liked to be out, but not late enough to explain the emptiness I felt stepping onto the street. The air was cool and dry, carrying the faint smell of dust and old rain, and the sidewalk reflected the glow of shop windows that were still lit despite being closed. I walked slowly, my bag heavy on my shoulder, letting my thoughts drift without settling on anything, the way they do when you're tired but not ready to go home yet. A few blocks down, I noticed her standing near the corner where the antique shop used to be, the one with the wide glass window that displayed nothing but carefully arranged emptiness. She wasn't close enough to touch the glass, just standing a few steps back, her posture relaxed, almost casual, as if she had all the time in the world. At first, I didn't think much of her. People pause at shop windows all the time, especially late at night when the glass turns into a mirror and you catch your own reflection unexpectedly. I assumed that was what she was doing, seeing herself in the dark pane, adjusting to the quiet. But as I drew closer, I realized she wasn't moving at all. She stood with her hands at her sides, head slightly tilted. Eyes fixed on the window with an intensity that made me slow my pace without realizing it. Her coat was light, too light for the temperature, and the fabric hung stiffly from her shoulders as if it hadn't been worn much. The shop window glowed softly, illuminated from within by a single overhead bulb, casting pale light onto the sidewalk. It was bright enough that I could see my own reflection faintly as I passed, layered over the dark interior of the shop. When she took a small step closer to the glass, something changed. The light inside the shop dimmed, not abruptly, not like someone had flipped a switch, but gradually, as if responding to her movement. It was subtle enough that I almost missed it, a gentle lowering of brightness that made the reflections on the sidewalk soften. I stopped walking. I told myself it was a coincidence, maybe a flicker in the aging electrical system, something that happened all the time in old buildings like this. Still, I watched her carefully, my attention narrowing until the rest of the street felt distant. She leaned forward slightly, her face now close to the glass, and the light dimmed further, the interior of the shop retreating into shadow. The objects inside, indistinct shapes and shelves, became harder to make out, like they were sinking away from view. My throat went dry. She didn't touch the glass. She didn't raise her hand or press her forehead against it. She just looked, and the window seemed to respond by withdrawing its light, inch by inch. I became acutely aware of the sounds around me, the distant hum of traffic, the soft click of a pedestrian signal changing somewhere behind me. None of it changed, and yet the space around the shop felt different, heavier, as if it were being insulated from the rest of the street. I took a step back without meaning to, my shoe scraping softly against the concrete, and the sound felt intrusive. Too loud for the moment. She didn't react, didn't even seem to notice my presence. The light dimmed again. Now the shop interior was barely visible, the bulb inside glowing faintly, like a tired eye struggling to stay open. The reflection of the streetlight above us grew stronger in the glass, overlaying the darkness within. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Old wiring. A failing bulb. A timer. Any explanation that didn't involve the woman standing there causing it simply by looking. She straightened slightly, shifting her weight, and the light held steady, neither dimming nor brightening. It was as if the window was waiting, attentive, poised to react. A car passed behind me, its headlights briefly flooding the sidewalk with white light, and for a second the reflection overwhelmed everything else. When the car was gone, the shop window was dimmer still, the interior almost completely swallowed by shadow. My pulse quickened. I realized then that no one else was stopping. A man walked past on the opposite side of the street, his phone pressed to his ear, his pace unbroken. A couple emerged from a bar further down, laughing quietly, their voices distant and uninvested. None of them looked at the woman or the window. It felt like I had stepped slightly out of alignment with the night. She took another small step forward, and the last of the light inside the shop faded, leaving only a faint glow near the ceiling, barely enough to suggest depth. The window now acted almost entirely as a mirror, reflecting the street behind us and our overlapping silhouettes. I could see her reflection clearly now. Her face was calm, almost blank, her eyes wide and focused, not on her own reflection, but on something deeper, something past it. The reflection of my own face hovered beside hers, pale and tense, an intrusion I didn't want. The bulb inside flickered weakly once, twice, and then settled into a low, steady dimness that felt deliberate rather than broken. I became aware of a strange sensation then, a pressure behind my eyes, like the beginning of a headache, or the feeling you get when you stare at something too long without blinking. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the cracks in the sidewalk, on anything else. When I looked back, she hadn't moved, but the window seemed darker still, absorbing light rather than emitting it. I wondered how long she had been standing there before I arrived, and whether the shop had been brighter when she first stopped. The thought made my stomach tighten. I considered speaking to her, asking if she was okay, if she needed help, but the words felt inappropriate, intrusive, like knocking on a door that wasn't meant to be opened. Something about her stillness warned me not to interrupt. The air near the window felt cooler, a subtle drop in temperature that raised goosebumps along my arms. The streetlight overhead hummed faintly, its glow unchanged, but it didn't seem to reach the glass anymore. She tilted her head a fraction to the side, and the reflection shifted with her, and for a brief moment I thought I saw movement in the dark interior of the shop, a suggestion of depth rearranging itself. I blinked hard, my eyes stinging, and the impression vanished. My heart was beating too fast now, and I became conscious of my breathing, shallow and quick. I didn't like how focused I felt, how narrow my awareness had become, like the window was drawing it in. She took a step back. The light inside the shop brightened slightly, just a little, enough to confirm the connection I didn't want to believe in. The response was immediate, smooth, as if the window had been waiting for permission. She paused, watching the change with quiet attention, and then stepped forward again. The light dimmed. The confirmation sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the night air. I forced myself to go upstairs, locking my apartment door behind me with more care than usual. That night, lying in bed, the quiet felt too deep, every small sound magnified. When I shifted my feet against the sheets, I listened automatically for a delayed response, a softer movement following my own. Sometimes, just before sleep takes me, I swear I can still hear it, a slower step matching mine somewhere just out of reach, waiting for me to start walking again. I felt suddenly like I was witnessing something private, an exchange that didn't include me, and my presence felt wrong. I glanced around again, searching for anyone else who might notice, anyone whose reaction could anchor this in normalcy. The street continued on as it always had, indifferent and steady. A bus rumbled by at the far end of the block, its sound distant and muffled, and the vibration under my feet felt disconnected from what I was seeing. The shop window remained dark, responsive only to her. She stood there for another long moment, and I began to feel an uncomfortable sense of anticipation, like the air before a storm when everything holds its breath. Then she turned her head slightly, just enough that her eyes shifted away from the glass. The shop window brightened. The bulb inside glowed stronger, filling the interior with pale light once more, revealing shelves and objects that hadn't moved at all. The transition was smooth and immediate, as if nothing strange had happened. She looked at the window one last time, and it dimmed just a fraction, a subtle acknowledgement, before settling into its original brightness. Without looking at me, she turned and walked down the street, her footsteps soft and unhurried, blending easily into the night. The light in the shop remained steady as she left, indifferent now that her attention was gone. I stood there for several seconds, staring at the glass, half expecting it to react to me, to dim in response to my gaze. It didn't. No matter how intensely. And for reasons I still can't explain, I didn't stop to look at it. I didn't notice the street sign right away because there was nothing dramatic about the night itself. It was the kind of evening that fades quietly, the sky already dark but still holding onto a dull gray where the clouds reflected city light. I remember checking the weather earlier and seeing no wind listed at all, which stood out later more than it should have. I was walking home from a small grocery store a few blocks away, plastic bag cutting into my fingers, the faint smell of bread and detergent mixing in the cool air. It was around 11:21 p.m., late enough that most of the houses had gone dark, but early enough that the street still felt owned by people, not shadows. The road was empty, no cars passing, no distant engines humming in the background. Even the usual background noise felt muted, like the neighborhood had been wrapped in something soft. My footsteps sounded clear and slightly hollow, echoing between parked cars and quiet porches. I passed under a streetlight that flickered once as I moved beneath it, not enough to alarm me, just enough to register. The light steadied, and I kept walking, my thoughts slow and unfocused, drifting the way they do when you're tired but not yet ready to sleep. The street sign stood at the corner ahead of me, mounted on a thin metal pole, the reflective lettering catching the streetlight at an angle. I'd passed it hundreds of times before without ever really seeing it. That night, something about it drew my attention without asking permission. As I approached, I became aware of how still the air was. Not just calm, but completely unmoving. The leaves on the trees were frozen in place, and a discarded receipt near the curb lay flat and undisturbed. The absence of wind made everything feel staged. I slowed slightly as I reached the corner, adjusting the bag in my hand, and that was when I saw it. The street sign bent. Not suddenly. Not sharply. Just a slight, almost polite curve inward, the top edge tilting down and toward me by a few degrees, like someone leaning in to hear better. The movement was slow enough that I doubted my own perception, gentle enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't already been looking directly at it. I stopped walking. The sign held its position, bent just enough to be wrong, the metal pole curving where it absolutely shouldn't have. Street signs are rigid, anchored deep into concrete, designed to withstand weather and time. This one looked like it was responding. I felt a strange tightness in my chest, not fear exactly, more like confusion settling into something heavier. My first thought was heat, maybe the metal expanding unevenly, though the night was cool and the temperature steady. The explanation didn't feel solid, but I clung to it anyway. I took a step closer. The sign didn't move further, but the bend seemed more pronounced now that I was nearer, the angle unmistakable. The reflective surface caught my face faintly, warped slightly by the curve, and I didn't like how close it felt. I became aware then of how quiet everything was. No insects. No distant traffic. Even the hum from the streetlight above felt subdued, like it was happening far away. The silence didn't feel empty so much as attentive. I shifted my weight, the grocery bag rustling softly, and the sound felt too loud, like I'd spoken in a room meant for whispers. My heart was beating harder now, each pulse noticeable in my ears. Without really deciding to, I spoke. "Hello?" The word came out quietly, almost apologetic, and as it left my mouth, the sign bent a fraction more. Just enough to register. Just enough to erase doubt. The movement wasn't jerky or forced. It was smooth, controlled, as if the metal were flexible, compliant. The pole curved further toward me, the sign's face angling down. Its reflective letters catching less light now, dimming naturally with the shift. My throat went dry. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sign stayed bent, poised, the way someone freezes mid-lean when they realize they've been noticed. I laughed softly under my breath, a reflex more than a choice, the sound thin and unconvincing. "That's not funny," I said, though I couldn't say who I was addressing. The sign did not straighten. Instead, I had the unmistakable impression that it was waiting. A cold sensation crept up my arms, raising goosebumps despite the mild night. I looked around the street, desperate for context, for something else to anchor this moment. Houses lined the block, dark and quiet. No lights flicked on. No doors opened. No one else seemed present enough to notice. I took a step back. The sign straightened slightly. Not fully. Just enough to mirror my movement, maintaining the same subtle angle between us, like a conversation adjusting its distance. That realization landed slowly and then all at once, heavy and undeniable. I felt suddenly exposed, like I'd stepped into the wrong role without knowing the rules. My mind raced through explanations, stress, fatigue, some strange optical illusion, but none of them could account for the timing, the responsiveness. I cleared my throat again, the sound brittle in the stillness. "It's just a sign," I muttered, more for myself than anything else. The metal creaked. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, a soft, strained sound that made my stomach drop. Street signs don't make noise unless acted upon by force, and nothing else was touching it. The bend deepened again, slow and deliberate, the top edge lowering another inch, the pole curving like a spine-adjusting posture. The sign was no longer pretending to be rigid. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to be careful with my words, to choose them gently, as if volume or tone might matter. I forced myself to go upstairs, locking my apartment door behind me with more care than usual. That night, lying in bed, the quiet felt too deep, every small sound magnified. When I shifted my feet against the sheets, I listened automatically for a delayed response, a softer movement following my own. Sometimes, just before sleep takes me, I swear I can still hear it, a slower step matching mine somewhere just out of reach, waiting for me to start walking again. "I didn't mean to interrupt," I said quietly, and immediately hated myself for saying it. The sign held still. That felt worse. I realized then that my breathing had changed, shallow and controlled, and that I was standing unnaturally straight, like my body was trying not to offend something it didn't understand. The night felt closer, heavier, like the air itself had leaned in too. A car passed somewhere far away, its sound muted and delayed, and for a moment I expected the sign to react to that instead, to turn away from me toward the noise. It didn't. Its attention felt fixed. I took another step backward, my heel scraping softly against the pavement. The sign eased back with me, maintaining that slight curve, that listening posture. The movement was subtle, respectful, and deeply wrong. My pulse hammered in my throat. I didn't know what it wanted, or if want even applied, but the sense of being engaged in something unfinished pressed against my thoughts. Like if I left too abruptly, I'd be breaking a rule I hadn't agreed to but was still bound by. "I'm just going home," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The sign straightened a little more this time, though not completely. The pole still carried a faint curve, like a muscle that hadn't fully relaxed. I waited, unsure what I was waiting for. Nothing else happened. After a long, stretched moment, I forced myself to turn and walk away, each step measured, careful not to rush. I didn't look back right away, afraid that seeing it move again might low. I didn't notice the chalk at first because the sidewalk was already messy with old markings, the kind kids leave behind without thinking. Half circles, faded numbers, broken hopscotch grids that had been washed thin by rain and time. It was early evening, just after sunset, the sky still holding a dull blue that made everything feel unfinished, and I was walking home the long way because the shorter route felt too quiet lately. The air was cool, dry enough to carry sound clearly, and my footsteps echoed lightly between apartment buildings that all looked the same when the lights started to fade. I remember feeling unusually alert, like I'd had too much coffee, even though I hadn't, and I kept glancing at my phone to check the time without really caring what it said. I was passing a small playground when I saw the first mark near the curb, a single chalk line drawn cleanly across the concrete. It stood out because it was bright white, newer than the others, untouched by shoes or weather, and it looked intentional in a way that made me slow down. I told myself it was nothing, probably kids from earlier in the day, but as I walked closer, I noticed the line wasn't random. It was straight, deliberate, and angled toward the sidewalk, like it was pointing somewhere. I followed it without meaning to. A few steps ahead, another chalk mark waited, this one curved, forming part of a letter. I stopped then, my foot hovering mid-step, and felt a small, sharp discomfort settle in my chest. The shape looked familiar in a way I didn't like. I crouched down slightly, keeping my distance, and studied it more closely. The chalk was thick, the kind used by adults or teachers, not the thin sticks kids usually snapped in half. The line was confident, pressed hard into the concrete, leaving powder gathered along the edges. It was an A. I stood back up quickly, my heart beating faster than it should have. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that letters were common, that I was projecting meaning where there was none. Still, I scanned the ground ahead, my eyes moving faster now, searching for something I didn't want to find. The next letter was there. And the next. They weren't clustered together. They were spaced out along the sidewalk, each one positioned a few feet apart, as if meant to be read while walking. The spacing matched my stride almost perfectly, something I didn't notice right away but felt in my body as I moved. I stopped walking altogether. The name wasn't common. It wasn't something you'd expect to see written by accident or coincidence. And yet there it was, letter by letter, chalked neatly into the concrete of a street I walked every day. My name. I felt exposed standing there, like the sidewalk had spoken something private out loud. The street around me hadn't changed, cars still passed at the far end of the block, a dog barked somewhere behind a fence, but the space where I stood felt narrowed, focused. I looked around quickly, my first instinct to find someone watching, someone laughing quietly at a prank I didn't understand. The playground was empty. The nearby windows reflected only the sky and my own tense posture. I knelt down this time, closer than before, and traced the last letter with my eyes without touching it. The chalk dust looked fresh, unmoved by wind or footsteps, as if it had been written recently, maybe minutes ago. That was when I noticed something else. There were footprints. They weren't obvious. Not like muddy shoe prints or clear impressions, but faint smudges in the chalk dust itself, soft disturbances that suggested someone had walked here after writing, careful not to step on the letters. The path curved away from the name and continued down the sidewalk. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff, and followed the direction of the marks with my eyes. The sidewalk ahead looked normal, but now I was aware of details I'd ignored before. Slight scuffs. Chalk dust in places it didn't belong. A sense of continuity that made my skin crawl. I didn't want to follow them. I also didn't want to leave the letters behind, like walking away would mean accepting that they could just exist without explanation. I took a few cautious steps forward, my eyes glued to the ground, my breathing shallow. Another letter appeared. Just one this time. It was the first letter of my name again. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a name written once. It was repeating. Each time, the letters appeared spaced the same way, aligned with the cracks in the sidewalk, positioned so you'd read them only if you walked at a normal pace. Too fast and you'd miss them. Too slow and the rhythm would break. I became painfully aware of my own movement, how my body naturally adjusted to the spacing, how my steps fell into sync with the markings without me consciously choosing it. The realization made me stop abruptly, my heel scraping loudly against the concrete. The sound echoed more than it should have. I stood there listening, half expecting footsteps behind me, chalk scraping, anything that would explain this. The night stayed quiet, attentive in a way that felt deliberate. I pulled out my phone and took a photo, my hands shaking slightly as I framed the letters. On the screen, they looked ordinary, almost childish, which somehow made the situation worse. There was nothing dramatic or threatening about them visually. They were just there. I checked the time again, needing proof that time was still moving normally. Only 5 minutes had passed since I entered the block. It felt longer, stretched thin by awareness. I looked back the way I'd come. From this angle, I could see the first name clearly, spelled cleanly on the sidewalk behind me, waiting. The sight sent a quiet wave of nausea through me, not fear exactly, but a deep discomfort, like realizing someone knew where you lived without ever asking. I turned forward again and saw that the chalk continued past the playground, down the block, following the curve of the street. The markings didn't get messy or rushed. They stayed precise, consistent, patient. As if there was no hurry. I thought about all the people who could know my name, co-workers, neighbors, friends, and none of them made sense in this context. None of them would do this, and none of them would stay hidden if they had. I took another step forward. Nothing happened. No sound. No movement. Just another chalk letter waiting exactly where my foot was about to land. I adjusted my step at the last second, avoiding it, and felt a strange relief when my shoe didn't disturb the dust. It felt important not to touch them. As I walked, I noticed the chalk marks weren't everywhere. They appeared only when I was looking for them, spaced so that my eyes naturally dropped to them between steps. When I looked up, the street felt ordinary again, almost aggressively normal. I wondered how many times I'd walked this street without noticing anything unusual, and whether the chalk had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Halfway down the block, I stopped again. The letters stopped too. The sidewalk ahead was clean, bare concrete stretching toward the intersection. No chalk. No dust. Just an abrupt ending that made my chest tighten. I waited. After a few seconds, I took one step forward. Another letter appeared at the edge of my vision, just barely visible near the curb. I didn't remember seeing it before. I backed up slowly. The letter was still there. That was when I realized the chalk wasn't just ahead of me. It was adjusting. I felt a sudden urge to leave, strong enough to override my curiosity. I turned sharply and started walking back the way I'd come, my pace quickening despite my effort to stay calm. The letters didn't vanish. They stayed exactly where they were, spelling my name backward now as I retraced my steps, as if they'd always been arranged that way and I'd only just learned how to read them. I broke into a jog, my breath loud in my ears, my shoes slapping against the pavement. I didn't look down anymore. I couldn't. When I reached the end of the block and turned onto a brighter street, I finally slowed, my heart hammering, my palms damp. I forced myself to look back one last time. The sidewalk was empty. No chalk. No markings. No dust. Just plain concrete, worn and unremarkable. I stood there for a long time, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself it had been a coincidence, a prank, stress layering meaning where there was none. Later that night, after I got home, washed my hands, and tried to distract myself with television, I noticed something on the bottom of my shoe. A thin white smear of chalk dust. When I checked the other shoe, there was more. And when I brushed it away, I realized the pattern it left on the floor spelled my name again, this time facing inward, toward the apartment. That I didn't notice the cold at first because the night itself was mild, almost gentle, the kind of early autumn evening where the air feels worn smooth from the day. It was 9:58 p.m. according to the pharmacy clock I'd glanced at before turning down my street, and the sidewalks were still faintly warm from the sun. People were around, not many, but enough that the street felt occupied. I was halfway home, walking without urgency, listening to the soft scrape of my shoes and the distant sound of traffic folding in and out of the gaps between buildings. The streetlights had just flickered on, that brief moment where the city shifts gears, and everything looked a little flatter, a little quieter. She came into view ahead of me near the bus stop. At first, there was nothing unusual about her. She was just another person walking alone, moving in my direction on the same sidewalk. I registered her the way you register anyone approaching at night, a quick mental note of distance and pace, nothing more. She walked steadily, not hurried, not slow, her hands tucked into the pockets of a dark coat that looked heavier than it needed to be. Her head was slightly lowered, eyes forward, and she stayed close to the edge of the sidewalk rather than the storefronts, a small detail that stuck with me for reasons I couldn't place. As the space between us closed, I became aware of a faint change in the air. It wasn't a breeze. The leaves on the trees overhead didn't move. There was no shift in sound, no rush or whisper to signal wind. It was just cooler. A subtle drop in temperature that brushed against my face and hands like a question. I slowed without meaning to. She didn't. The cold followed her, not spreading outward, not filling the street, but staying close, contained in a narrow space around her body. The closer she got, the more noticeable it became, until my fingers felt stiff and my breath caught slightly in my chest. I told myself it was imagination, that maybe I'd stepped into a shadow or that my body was reacting to the night finally settling. Still. My awareness sharpened, every sense leaning toward her approach. When she was only a few steps away, the cold deepened. It wasn't sharp or biting, not the kind that makes you shiver immediately. It was heavy, dense, like the air had thickened and lost warmth all at once. My skin prickled, and I felt an instinctive urge to step aside, to give her more room than necessary. She passed me without looking up. The moment our shoulders aligned, the temperature dropped suddenly, dramatically, like walking past an open freezer door. The cold pressed into me from one side, wrapping around my arm, my neck, my chest, and for a brief second, it felt difficult to breathe. I stopped walking. She kept going. The cold moved with her, sliding away from me as she passed, retreating down the sidewalk in her wake. The air around me warmed again almost immediately, leaving behind a strange hollow sensation, like warmth returning to a limb after numbness. I stood there, heart pounding, my breath visible for reasons I couldn't explain. A couple walked past me from the opposite direction, talking quietly, completely unaffected. They didn't slow. They didn't react. They didn't even glance back. I turned slowly to look at her. She was already several yards away, walking at the same steady pace, her outline shrinking under the streetlights. The space around her still looked normal, but I knew now what it felt like, and the memory clung to me. I started walking again, hesitant at first, then more confidently, my eyes fixed on her back. With every step she took farther away, the street seemed to settle, sounds returning to their usual balance, the city breathing normally again. I should have let it go. Instead, I followed her. Not closely, not obviously, just enough to confirm what I thought I'd felt. I stayed on my side of the sidewalk, matching her pace from a distance, watching for any sign that the cold would return. It didn't. Not until I closed the gap again. As I drew nearer, the air began to cool once more, gently at first, then more noticeably, like crossing an invisible boundary. My skin tightened, and my hands felt numb in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. She didn't react. She didn't change pace or posture. She didn't turn her head. It felt like she didn't know I was there. Or like it didn't matter. We reached an intersection, and she stopped at the curb without hesitation, standing perfectly still as she waited for the light to change. I stopped several feet behind her, unwilling to get closer, the cold pooling faintly around her like a quiet presence. Cars passed in front of us, headlights flashing, engines humming, the normal noise of the street continuing uninterrupted. The drivers didn't slow. The pedestrians crossing from the other side didn't notice anything strange. I watched her breath. I couldn't see it. Mine came out in short, pale bursts. The signal changed, and she stepped forward immediately. As she moved away, the cold lifted again, leaving behind that same uneasy hollow in my chest. I crossed after her, my steps slower now, my thoughts tight and careful. I didn't know what I expected to learn, only that letting her disappear without understanding felt wrong. Halfway across the intersection, I noticed something else. The cold didn't return fully this time. Instead, it lingered faintly around me, like a residue that hadn't completely faded. My arms felt heavy. My fingers tingled. I stopped in the middle of the crosswalk, forcing myself to breathe evenly. The feeling didn't go away. She reached the far curb and continued down a side street without looking back. I watched her turn the corner, the darkness swallowing her almost immediately, and with her disappearance, the last of the cold finally drained from the air. The relief was sharp and unsettling. I finished crossing and stood there for a moment, staring down the street she'd taken, my body slowly remembering what normal temperature felt like. The city moved on around me, indifferent and loud again. I didn't follow her further. I went home instead, my pace quick, my senses still tuned too high. Inside my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing until my heart slowed. Later, lying in bed, I replayed the moment she passed me again and again, trying to pinpoint exactly when the cold began and ended. It always lined up with her presence, never before, never after. Sometime after midnight, I got up for a glass of water and paused near the window without thinking. Down on the street below, a lone figure walked under the streetlights, her pace steady, her coat dark. As she passed beneath my building, the glass of the window grew cold against my hand. I didn't pull away until she was gone. The first time I noticed the sound, I assumed it was broken. It was just after midnight, the kind of hour where the city feels hollowed out, running on leftovers of movement and noise. I had stayed late at work, longer than usual, not because I needed to, but because the thought of the walk home unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. When I finally left, the building was dark behind me, my footsteps too loud in the lobby, the door closing with a soft finality that echoed longer than it should have. The street outside was damp from an earlier rain. Not enough to puddle, just enough to darken the asphalt and give the sidewalks a faint shine under the streetlights. The air smelled clean and cold, carrying distant engine noise that never quite reached me. I reached the intersection at the end of the block and stopped automatically at the crosswalk. The white walking figure was already lit. Beneath it, the speaker chirped its familiar pattern, that steady, reassuring beep meant to guide people across. It was a sound I'd heard thousands of times, so ordinary I usually filtered it out completely. I stepped off the curb and crossed without thinking. Halfway across, I realized the beep hadn't stopped. It continued at the same steady rhythm, unchanged, even though the signal should have gone silent by now. I slowed, glancing up at the light. The walking figure had switched to the flashing hand, counting down silently with red numbers I could barely see from this angle. The beep kept going. I reached the other side and stepped onto the sidewalk, expecting the sound to cut off the moment my feet left the street. It didn't. It stayed exactly the same, evenly spaced, patient, like it was waiting for something else. I turned back toward the intersection. No one else was there. The road was empty in both directions, the traffic light cycling through colors for no one. The crosswalk sign showed the solid red hand now, unmistakable even from a distance. The beep continued. I stood there listening, hands in my pockets, trying to decide if this was worth caring about. Malfunctioning signals weren't unheard of. Old infrastructure failed all the time. Still, something about the consistency bothered me. It didn't stutter or glitch or change pitch. It behaved as if it were still actively guiding someone across. I checked the opposite curb. Nothing. I took a step away from the intersection. The sound followed me, not physically moving, but remaining audible far longer than it should have. I could still hear it clearly even after I'd walked half a block, the rhythm threading itself between my thoughts. Only when I turned the corner did it finally fade, swallowed by distance and buildings. I told myself I was tired. The next night, it happened again. This time, I approached the same intersection more cautiously, already aware of how quiet the street felt, how the air seemed to hold onto sound instead of letting it dissipate. A light mist hung low, softening the edges of everything, and the glow of the streetlights felt dimmer than usual. I stopped at the curb and waited. The walking figure appeared. The beep started. I didn't move. I wanted to see what would happen if I stayed where I was, if the sound would stop on its own once the signal changed. I watched the countdown numbers tick down slowly, my breath steady, my attention fixed. The hand appeared. The beep did not stop. It kept going, unchanged, even though no one had stepped into the crosswalk. Even though I was standing still, clearly visible beneath the streetlight. A car passed through the intersection, the driver not slowing, not reacting to the sound at all. The beep continued underneath the engine noise, precise and insistent. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, like the beginnings of a headache, or like the sound was pulling my attention toward the street against my will. I stepped back. The beep kept going. I crossed anyway, my skin prickling as I moved through the space the sound seemed to occupy. The moment my foot touched the opposite curb, a sudden certainty settled over me that the sound hadn't been meant for me this time. I didn't look back. By the third night, I was listening for it before I even reached the intersection. The city felt thinner somehow, like the spaces between things had widened. My footsteps echoed too clearly. A trash bag rustling in the wind sounded like movement behind me until I turned and saw nothing. When I reached the crosswalk, the signal was already red. No beep. I waited, holding my breath without realizing it. The light changed. The walking figure lit up. The beep started. I stayed where I was, staring straight ahead. As the seconds passed, the sound began to feel closer, not louder, just more present, like it was occupying the same space as my thoughts. I became aware of how evenly it repeated. How perfectly consistent the timing was, too perfect for something mechanical. When the signal changed, the beep continued. I closed my eyes. For a moment, I imagined footsteps matching the rhythm, slow, deliberate, crossing an empty street I couldn't see. The image came uninvited, detailed enough to make my chest tighten. I opened my eyes quickly. The crosswalk was still empty. The sound didn't waver. I crossed with stiff movements, my muscles tense, and once again, the beep followed me longer than it should have, lingering even as I put distance between myself and the intersection. That night, I dreamed of standing at the curb while the sound repeated endlessly, the light never changing, the street stretching longer every time I tried to cross. I started taking a different route after that. It didn't help. A week later, I encountered it at a different intersection entirely, one I rarely used. The beep was the same tone, the same rhythm, familiar in a way that made my stomach drop. I stopped short, a few steps from the curb, my heart already racing. The signal changed. The beep started. I looked around instinctively, scanning the sidewalk, the storefronts, the empty bus stop nearby. No one was waiting with me. No one approached from either direction. I stayed put. The sound continued past the change, past the moment it should have ended, filling the quiet street with purpose. I noticed then that the light wasn't cycling anymore. The traffic signal stayed green in both directions, cars passing through without stopping, as if the crosswalk no longer existed. The beep kept going. A thought surfaced slowly, reluctantly, forming itself without my permission. What if it wasn't signaling the light? What if it was signaling presence? My mouth felt dry. I took a step backward, then another, increasing the distance between myself and the curb. The sound didn't get quieter. It didn't react at all. I turned and walked away, my pace quickening despite my effort to stay calm. The beep followed me down the block, through the next intersection, bleeding faintly into the background noise of the city. It didn't stop when I reached my building. I heard it in the elevator, muffled but steady, threading through the hum of the cables. I heard it in the hallway, soft but unmistakable, echoing faintly between doors. Inside my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, listening. The sound faded slowly, reluctantly, like something moving farther away rather than switching off. Later, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, every nerve awake. The room was silent, too silent, the kind that makes you notice your own breathing. Just as I began to relax, just as sleep edged closer, I heard it again. Very faint. Very steady. Beeping. Coming from somewhere far below my window, repeating patiently, as if the light had changed long ago and someone was still crossing, step by careful step, through an empty street that hadn't noticed yet. That I remember glancing down at my watch that night because the streetlights were flickering in a rhythm that made me feel uneasy, uneven, like the world was stuttering around me. It was raining lightly, the kind of drizzle that doesn't soak you but leaves a thin, cold layer of damp on your jacket and hair. I had just left a friend's apartment, the building warm behind me, and stepped onto the slick sidewalk with no one else around. My footsteps echoed softly, each one accompanied by the quiet splatter of rain droplets from the eaves. The street was deserted, save for the occasional car passing too far away to break the stillness. I liked walking alone sometimes, even at night, because it forced me to slow down and notice things I normally ignored. That night, I noticed everything, and nothing felt quite right. I looked down at my watch because something in the quiet made me want reassurance, a tether to reality. The hands didn't make sense. I squinted, thinking I had read them wrong, or maybe the reflection from the streetlight had thrown me off. I checked again. Yesterday. It wasn't just a vague date, or a day that might have seemed close in memory. The watch said yesterday, clearly, exactly, as if I had stepped through a small, precise window into the past. My first instinct was disbelief. Watches don't lie, not unless they're broken. And this one wasn't broken. I'd worn it every day for years. I looked around, hoping to find a clue in the street, in the buildings, in the passing cars. Nothing. Everything was exactly where it should be. The apartment building still hummed with faint light, the neon signs on the corner shop flickered the same tired way, and the occasional car still rolled by with tires hissing on wet asphalt. Nothing had changed. Except the date on my watch. I checked my phone, trembling slightly, fingers slick from rain. Today. Today was clearly today. I felt a sudden, sharp dissonance between the two readings, and my mind raced to reconcile it. Maybe I'd forgotten to change something, maybe the watch had reset, maybe, something. I took a cautious step forward. The puddles reflected streetlights that seemed normal, but the air smelled different. Hard to describe. Not unpleasant, just older somehow, like the faint tang of dust and wet leaves after a long, undisturbed rain. My jacket clung to my shoulders in a way that felt heavier than it should. I checked the watch again. Still yesterday. I stopped walking entirely, mid-block, staring at the tiny hands, feeling my pulse spike. I touched the crown and twisted it gently, thinking a manual adjustment might reset it. Nothing changed. The date remained stubbornly, impossibly, behind. A car passed in the distance, its headlights slicing through the wet street. The light reflected off puddles and asphalt, gleaming normally. The driver didn't pause, didn't notice anything unusual. Everything else was normal. Everything except me. 83,551. I looked up and down the street. There were shadows, shapes moving at the periphery of the light, but nothing concrete. My footsteps on the slick sidewalk seemed louder now, too deliberate, as if the sound itself was recording the moment. I tried moving again, slowly, testing whether my steps would shift the rhythm of the world. Each movement felt deliberate, measured, but nothing changed. The street stayed the same, the lights stayed the same, the drizzle continued in the same irregular rhythm. Only my watch remained stuck in yesterday. I reached the next corner, hesitating before I turned. My reflection in a darkened storefront window flickered strangely, like the glass was lagging a frame behind. I leaned closer to see it more clearly. My face was my own, pale and tense in the dim light, but somehow the reflection felt different. Slightly wrong, as if a second version of me was staring back, just behind the glass, smiling faintly when I didn't. I jumped back, breathing hard, and looked at my watch again. Yesterday. The thought struck me with a quiet, gnawing horror. What if the date wasn't the only thing behind? What else might be delayed? Or waiting? Or following? I started walking faster, forcing myself to put distance between me and that intersection. The puddles reflected streetlights normally, the neon flickers remained the same, but every shadow now seemed to stretch a little longer, every sound arriving just a fraction late. The street had the same shape, the same buildings, but something fundamental had shifted in the timing of it all. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, the fog of a long day making my mind play tricks. But the watch didn't lie. It stayed stubbornly on yesterday, a precise, immovable anchor. When I finally reached my apartment building, I hesitated on the steps, glancing back down the street. The light from the corner shop flickered as if nothing had changed, as if everything had always been ordinary. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, my hands shaking enough that the key scraped the lock. I set the watch on the table and stared at it for a long time, tracing the small, cruel hands with my finger. Outside, the rain continued to fall lightly, the city humming as usual. Inside, my heartbeat echoed like a warning. I didn't sleep that night. When I finally did, I dreamt of walking home again, the drizzle soft on my shoulders, the streetlights flickering in rhythm. I checked my watch. Yesterday. And I woke before knowing if I ever made it home. I noticed her ahead of me before I realized I was already keeping pace. It was late, close to 1 in the morning, the hour when the city feels thinned out, like only the most necessary things are still moving. The rain had stopped, but the ground still held onto the damp, reflecting streetlights in broken streaks. I had left my apartment because I couldn't sleep. The quiet inside had begun to feel heavier than the quiet outside. She was walking on the same sidewalk, about half a block ahead. At first, she blended into the night. Dark coat, steady stride, nothing that demanded attention. I would have ignored her completely if not for the way my body reacted before my mind did. My steps slowed slightly, then adjusted, until the distance between us stayed exactly the same. I became aware of my breathing. Too loud. Too present. The street was nearly empty. A few parked cars lined the curb, their windows fogged, their shapes softened by moisture. Somewhere far off, a train horn sounded once, low and distant, then nothing again. She walked without hesitation, never pausing at cracks or puddles, as if she knew the sidewalk by memory. I told myself I wasn't following her. We were just going the same way. It happens all the time. Still, I didn't pass her. I could have. The sidewalk was wide enough, and my pace was naturally faster. But every time I considered it, a tight feeling formed in my chest, and my steps stayed measured, restrained, keeping that same careful distance. The sound of my footsteps seemed to change the closer I paid attention to them. They felt heavier, slower, like they were arriving a moment later than expected. I wondered if she could hear them too. She didn't look back. We reached an intersection where the street narrowed, the lights dimmer here, spaced farther apart. Her silhouette stretched long across the pavement, bending slightly with the uneven ground. I felt a sudden awareness of how exposed I was, standing in open space with nowhere to blend in. She stopped at the corner. So did I. Cars passed through the intersection, headlights sweeping over us briefly, illuminating her coat, her shoes, the edge of her hair. I tried not to stare, but my eyes kept finding her outline, fixing on the small details that made her feel solid, real. The light changed. She didn't move right away. That was when she turned. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't face me fully. She just turned her head slightly, enough that I could see the side of her face under the streetlight. Her eyes met mine. Only for a second. There was no expression there. No warning. No curiosity. Just a brief, quiet acknowledgement, like a glance exchanged between people who already understand something unspoken. Then she turned forward again and stepped into the crosswalk. My stomach dropped. The space she left behind felt colder, emptier, like the air had been disturbed and hadn't settled yet. I stood frozen on the curb, my heart beating hard enough to feel in my throat. I told myself not to follow. The thought came clearly, urgently, and I almost listened to it. I stayed where I was for a few seconds longer, watching her move farther away, her figure growing smaller with each step. She didn't look back again.